Hey everybody, and welcome back to Parkitect. In the last episode I finished the slightly out-of-screen Coaster Canyon, and in today's episode I want to work on Pagoda Valley. Now the reason is that Coaster Canyon was a super long episode, and after that I want to do a quick and easy park. And I know from experience, which is building this park myself, that it's not really too difficult to get through. The scenario goals are only to have 500 people in the park, and you already start out with 2 decent coasters, so that shouldn't be too difficult. And the scenario description is that it's a secluded valley which presents an ideal location for a thrilling coaster park. The nearby temple is fine with your use of the land, as long as you respect the existing structures. Now by that I meant that you're not allowed to remove anything that's already there, so you have to work around it. But of course, you can argue to what extent it is respectful to build a coaster above the temples, which you can technically do, but let's not get into minute details and actually start looking at what we've got here. Now, I should also say, I've seen a lot of comments about the fact that this is a very easy scenario. I've been watching all the responses and feedback to the scenarios as much as possible, and it's been really interesting and informative to see what people like and what they don't like about the campaign. But one of the common complaints that I've seen is that Pagoda Valley is notoriously easy, which I also have to say I'm gonna need to blame myself a bit for this one. When I originally passed this over to the devs, I think I categorized it in medium difficulty. So for a lot of the scenarios that I gave them, I categorized their difficulty somewhat, and many of them I actually gave them goals myself, although they changed quite a few of them, and some of the scenarios I even didn't give any goals when I handed them over. But anyway, this one I categorized as medium difficulty, thinking that the terrain would be one of the most, difficult things about this scenario. And while I guess that's true to some extent, the only real buildable section that you've got is over here. But having 2 coasters that are both really good when it comes to stats, and having an objective to only get 500 people on the park, is really not very medium difficulty and quite easy. The only thing that I guess is very good about this is the fact that it sits in the middle of the scenario map pack together with Sakura Gardens, I believe. Which is thematically quite cool. But that said, I think Sakura Gardens is going to be much more difficult than this one. Anyway, let's stop talking very critically about this scenario. I don't want to make it sound as if I don't like this one. Honestly, this is one of my favorites that I've worked on. It's one of the more scenery-focused ones. And I thought it would be quite an interesting setting for a scenario. And before I get into this, I actually want to show some quick on-rides of these coasters, because I think I would probably be doing everyone a disservice if I didn't show that. So we've got the Persimmon Blitz here and the Sakura Shooter. Not the greatest names, I know, but I always liked scenarios in Roller Coaster Tycoon that started out with dueling coasters in them, and that's where a lot of the inspiration for this scenario came from. And if I recall correctly, actually, I made this one a long time ago. This was definitely one of the earlier scenarios that I made, when the ability to recolor trees was kind of new. I'm not entirely sure, but I think so. So this one kind of shows off how many variations of different tree colors you can also have, being a park set in Japan during the autumn. So I thought that was kind of neat. And yeah, really the only major thing in the park is these 2 dueling inverting coasters. Kind of similar to the ones that you find in one of the Roller Coaster Tycoon Loopy Landscapes or Corkscrew Follies parks, but I'm not entirely sure what that one's called anymore. It was somewhere in a swamp. I'm not entirely sure what it was called. Anyway, let's go to the red one now and see what that one looks like. One of these rides always wins and the other one always loses, so it's not really the best dueling coaster out there, but I think it works quite alright. I kind of like the color scheme on these as well. It's super unusual, but I feel like it works out, slightly too well, just for how weird these colors are. Oh, and I just love building inverting coasters. I don't know why. I mean, inverted coasters. They're definitely one of my favorite types. For some reason they look really satisfying. I feel like it's just the fact that they have these colors, these covers going over the wheels, which means that you can't see the wheels go around, so it really just looks like they're gliding over the track. But there's just something really satisfying about the way that these things look as they're going over these elements. So yeah, that's pretty much the layout. Quite simple, but the fact that there's two of them and that they kind of duel with different elements makes them a little bit more interesting, I think. So that's that. And then we've also got the actual temple here. It's not really quite the Japanese temple, it's really just the bare minimum basics that are here. A torii gate at the front, some kind of main temple building with a little place where you can smoke incense right in front of it, and then a 3-story pagoda. So it's all very small and minimal, but I thought it would make the setting of the scenario quite well. So yeah, that's it. Now let's actually look at what we have here, because I totally don't remember much of it. Lots of coasters, but very few flat rides, and just a monorail and no water rides, so that's very limited. And then we've got hot dogs, bubble tea, toilets, customizable shop, and a vending machine. So that's also really limited. We don't even have an information store. That's kind of annoying, actually. And what are we getting? Okay, we're getting a launch drop tower. I'm not going to complain about that. That's actually very nice. Actually, come think of it, we've got a suspended coaster and a hyper coaster as well. I think the hyper coaster was added after I already made this map, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I think I can keep researching thrill rides. That seems like a very worthwhile venture here. And yeah, do we have any staff? No, we don't, so we definitely need to hire some. But that's really all I need to do. For now, I'm just gonna take this area next to the entrance here and expand a bit here, see what I can build, and see how quickly I can get to those 500 guests. Let's go. Now, because this scenario focuses on scenery rather than rides, and the objectives are quite easy to fulfill, I want to also focus my playthrough on scenery, and even though I'll fit in a few rides at some point, I'll probably be putting the majority of effort into making buildings, especially here at the start of the time-lapse. Now, what I was envisioning for this valley between the hills was originally to be an area where you can build flat rides and get your park started, but in this playthrough I realized that this is actually a perfect place to build a small Japanese village in the style that you often find in mountains. And I was mostly inspired by a place called Shirakawa and Gokayama, which are two UNESCO World Heritage places actually of really old traditional towns with these traditional farmhouses. And these farmhouses are kind of different, I think, from what a lot of people think about when they think about Japanese architecture. Some of my friends even felt that it was almost a bit of a mix between European alpine architecture and Japanese architecture, which kind of makes sense because they're in mountain areas and these houses are very much built to handle all kinds of harsh weather conditions that you have there, and especially heavy snowfall. And the specific kind of house that I'm referring to is called a Gassho Zukuri, and it's these houses with very dense thatch roofs, very thick thatch roofs on top of them, which are very steep as well, and these roofs are mostly what make up the shapes of these houses, and they look very iconic because they will build villages with a bunch of these houses, with all of the houses facing the same direction, either north or south, which has something to do with the fact that it keeps them cooler in summer and keeps them warmer in winter, depending on the sunlight position, because they have to worry a lot about weather conditions, and the roofs are also made in such a way to easily be able to scoop snow off of them. But yeah, it just results in this really cool, iconic architectural style that I wanted to try and build a bit in Parkitect. Two of the things that are really difficult about this, though, is that the roofs are extremely steep in real life. I can't quite get them that steep in Parkitect, so I have to make do with just the 4-meter steep roofs, and also these roofs are really overhanging the buildings by quite a bit, and that's not really something that you can easily do in Parkitect. So what I ended up doing for the majority of these buildings is making the roofs completely on grid and stacking 2 roofs on top of each other to make that dense thatched roof look. And then the buildings underneath it are actually off-grid and just made out of basic shapes and pillars, just so these roofs can properly overhang over the actual buildings. And it makes it a bit more difficult to actually fit things inside. So one of the buildings, for instance, the one in the bottom right corner here, is the food court for the park, but it also had to fit an employee path. So the interior of the building being off-grid made it a bit difficult to fit in the stalls right and have the employee path go somewhere as well. So I'm adding some additions here and there which you wouldn't typically see on these buildings, just to make sure that it all fits in the grid and I can actually make these things kind of functional as well. But I think overall I managed to get them to look decently realistic and at least invoke the same style and atmosphere as these buildings have in real life. They're just really charming, really cute, and I think they fit into the mountain valley of this park really well as well. It's definitely not the kind of style that I was thinking about when I made this scenario, but given the fact that it's quite mountainous, I think it works out alright. Though that said, I won't be building every building in this park in this style. It's really just this village down here in the valley as you enter the park. Because I think it fits mostly this valley, but it's gonna be difficult to make coaster stations and things like that in this style, so I'll be dropping it for other ride-related things. In real life also, these buildings are very rare. They pretty much only exist in large numbers in the 2 villages that I just mentioned, as far as I'm aware of, because they take an insane amount of maintenance. Apparently, the thatched roofs need to be replaced every 30 years because thatched roofs are a huge hazard when it comes to mold and things like that, and always quite expensive and maintenance heavy. So in real life they're kind of rare, and the 2 villages that do exist are really just open air museums pretty much. It's not a thing that people will typically live in anymore nowadays. But especially with them being so rare, I can see why the focus on preserving them is such a big issue. Anyway, to finally build a ride at last in this park, I just built this twister here because it fits on a small footprint and it just about fits into this section of the valley, and it'd be a nice reason to plop down a simple pavilion with some other overhanging roofs. When it comes to making roofs overhanging, I think just the half pieces with their quarter corner pieces work well enough. Although, especially if you have gabled roofs, it doesn't really combine too well. But, I mean, since you're looking at buildings from above in Parkitect anyway, these pieces can usually give a decent illusion of having an overhanging roof and a slightly more off-grid building. Now, some other things that I found really cool about this building style when I was researching it is that apparently the name Gasho refers to the roof style that they have, and it somewhat literally translates to clasped hands in a way that you would when you're doing a prayer. So, you know, they kind of invoke the same idea as putting your hands together. Doesn't work quite as well in Parkitect with the slightly less steep roofs, but I can see where the idea is coming from. And what's also really interesting is that these buildings are built without hammers and nails, as a lot of traditional Japanese architecture is, which is really cool. And it's something that in general about Japanese architecture I think is really interesting. They're definitely not unique in that aspect, and a lot of amazing huge wooden structures in Japan have been built completely without hammers and nails, and just by binding things together or making all kinds of ways in which wood can come together, build certain joints that fit together and stay in place, and most of all carry your weight without having any nails. It's just something really special about Japanese carpentry, I suppose. And when it comes to all of those large pagodas and traditional temples, I think it's pretty much the case that all of them have been built without nails. Although in this case, these just being farmhouses, I think a lot of the roof structures are also just tied together with ropes and things like that, from what I've seen in any case. It's something which you'll often see theme parks emulate as well, but in theme parks a lot of times they do use nails and things like that, just hide them after the fact. So you've got a lot of theme parks with tiki themes or something like that, where it looks like you've got wooden beams connected by ropes, but very often it's more or less just an illusion. But in real life, it's definitely a thing that's been used for a long time. And it's actually part of the reason why so many wooden structures in Japan have been able to persist for so long. Just because the wood is completely unharmed in any way, and the way that these joints fit together, I don't know exactly how it works, but it definitely works because they've still got wooden structures that are over 1,000 years old. At least in my case, I've been able to visit the Pagoda, which is apparently, at least according to the Wikipedia page that I read before it, the oldest wooden structure in the world. It's somewhere in Nara, and I believe it's from the 5th century, somewhere around there. But yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Anyway, this is the last little farmhouse that I decided to build. This one's actually on grid because it's very small and it houses a toilet building, so I had to build this one on grid to actually make it fit a stall inside. So every now and then I had to make a few concessions, but that's basically the town all done. And at this point I wanted to move on and actually build a roller coaster because, well, building roller coasters is still my favorite part about this game, and I'm gonna need some roller coasters if I do want to make the objectives of the scenario, because although I've been saying that it's really easy, I'm not gonna get there with just scenery and flat rides alone. So we have the hyper coaster in the scenario, which I think is a perfect fit. We have a lot of land that's completely unexplored, so we can make a very terrain conforming hyper coaster, so that's what I ended up going for here. Got a station that's kind of perched on top of a hill, so we don't have to use too much energy in the rest of the layout, and we can get back into the station without having to break the coaster too much. And a large lift hill going up a hill, and a first drop that goes down into the river valley, which I think does some cool interaction there with the inverted coasters as well. And then the rest of the layout is just kind of standard B&M hyper fare. A bunch of hills, a bunch of turns, and it's back to the station. Everything is very low to the ground though, because I wanted to keep a decent sense of speed throughout this layout. And truth be told, it's not that tall anyway, it's probably a mega coaster as far as height is concerned. So I couldn't do too much with this layout, but I think overall it fits into the valley of the park quite well. And yeah, it's something that I think works for this kind of park. I wanted to go for something that's a bit more spread out, that looks kind of like the layouts of the inverted coasters, rather than something that's very compact and just uses one section of the park. It's also a good opportunity to stay in the theme of the temple that's already established, even though, I don't know, it's maybe a bit blasphemous that I'm using all kinds of religious imagery in a roller coaster, but oh well, I've done that so many times before, whatever. So this one is going to have this coaster is going to have a station that's on top of this hill, and it has a path that's straight ahead of it, going over this straight ridge, which was completely accidental, but the setup in the general area I think looks really cool, so I wanted to show this off as much as possible. It's just this building at the end of a straight path, which looks very picturesque. And the station itself is just kind of a generic Japanese building inspired by temples. Not the greatest, there's not a lot that I can really do with the different pieces that we have in game, especially given that there's not an Asian theme or anything like that. I did end up making it a bit more subtle and less detailed than I originally thought I would. So I swapped out the curving roofs for completely straight roofs because I thought the curving roofs were a bit over the top and looked a bit strange. So yeah, I'm keeping this building kind of boring and not too much of a show off, but I think the overall location within the park, with having that straight path right ahead of it lead to the station, looks really cool, and the way that it's perched on top of a hill as well, I think makes use of the landscape around it in a way that works very well. I should also say that all of the foliage that I'm placing around this is at least in some ways inspired by Japanese gardens and Japanese foliage in general. So a lot of round bushes scattered around the buildings, especially where I feel they could have been planted. And a lot of trying to mimic nature, but in a smaller version. So really just using very much the smaller foliage pieces in the game, scattering them around. I'll eventually scatter a few rocks around as well, because that's something that's kind of sorely missing at this point. But yeah, I'm trying to emulate somewhat the style of Japanese gardens as well here. And here we go again with the religious imagery. Putting a bunch of torii gates just in front of the station building, which, this is not an actual temple, so it doesn't really make sense necessarily to have these here. But from a theme park perspective, these torii gate tunnels are also always really cool. I really love them, so this is just about the perfect place to try and build one of these. The torii gates are not the best. Their top section is looking a bit off and a bit too wide, and it's missing the kind of details that you would realistically see. But honestly, I feel like for just a few red pillars and border pieces, they do the job quite well. I don't think there's much more that you could really do here without making it look over the top and perhaps even overly detailed compared to the rest of the park. As long as that giant torii gate that's right in front of the temple is detailed enough and looks good enough, I think it works out. Oh, and then my second coaster here, which I should probably actually talk about, is a junior coaster. And I'm pretty sure that this will actually just make me finish the scenario successfully, because having 2 extra coasters on top of also 2 flat rides that I built should easily be able to get us to 500 guests. Not to mention that I didn't do any campaigns yet, so I can always count on those to fill in the extra guests, so I'm pretty sure I'll be fine with just this. I decided to add a junior coaster because it's just about the only thing that can actually fit into this very tight space that I still have left here. And realistically, in the roster of coaster types that we have in the park so far, I just needed to have something that families could ride as well. So the junior coaster it is. Although this one also has a bit of an interesting layout, I think, because the station is actually one of the highest parts of the layout, and the lift hill comes kind of midway through the layout. And I'm using as much as possible the natural hills around it. So it's a very terrain conforming coaster as well. I also spent a really long time here trying to figure out what color scheme I wanted on this, because I'm trying to fit the color schemes of the different coasters together a bit. So we've got the inverted coasters with their yellow, turquoise, purple, red color scheme, which is a bit unusual, but I think it works together. Then we've got the hyper coaster with some different shades of blue, which I think works quite well with the colors that the inverted coaster have. But then for this junior coaster, I couldn't really figure out what would look good. And I really liked black, actually. That's like the other option that I was thinking about, but it just looked a bit too depressing and not as colorful as the rest of the park. And this is a very colorful park, aside from this, very colorful coasters and the autumn trees, of course. So I ended up going for a color scheme that's very similar to the default color scheme that this coaster type has, with a pink track and some greenish supports. It's not really my favorite color scheme, but in the context of the park as a whole, I think it looks best, and that's why I ended up going for this color scheme in the end. And I know this is not the first time that I've taken a lot of time trying to figure out what color scheme I wanted and just ended up going back to the default one. Now, if you noticed that in this entire playthrough I've mostly been focusing on scenery and I've been doing this whole scenario in a single time-lapse, that's honestly just because I wasn't struggling with gameplay too much here. There's not too much that I could really comment on. As you can see, I'm already making a decent amount of money, which is off of the 2 inverting coasters, or the 2 inverted coasters alone, which I didn't even build. So yeah, there's really not much to be concerned about in this scenario. It's mostly a very scenery focused scenario, and that's why I'm also just talking about that in this playthrough as well. There were really no management difficulties to this whatsoever. Maybe a few vandalism issues. I did face a lot of vandals, which was really annoying for a while, which I had to micromanage for a bit. But that aside, this was quite easy going. So I even focused on details that I wouldn't even do all of the times, like adding more detail to what's already built. So to the inverted coasters, for instance, I added a custom catwalk here, using some of the pieces and colors from the rest of the park to try and make it fit in a bit more, make it a bit more fancy. And I think that works quite alright. Plus, it makes these inverted coasters look a bit less scary because you could actually be evacuated from this lift hill now. Anyway, that's about it. I can see that I'm almost already reaching the objectives, so let's see how the park is doing. Obviously the park is doing quite alright. What I should have probably said is I just want to show off the park to you guys and show you a bit more in detail some of the things I've built. Now it looks like in 3 guests I'll be reaching the objectives. I might actually need to worry about this situation here. But yeah, there you go. I think that is it for this scenario. I should be seeing some confetti sometime soon, I believe. Yeah, there we go. So that was Pagoda Valley. Really surprisingly easy, and I know this has been a much shorter playthrough compared to most videos, but I really enjoyed it, especially this area with this rural Japanese village. I really enjoyed trying to use the pieces in a different way and coming up with a very different theme from what I'm usually doing. I just want to quickly look into what's the deal with these things. I'm not sure if there's... Okay, so somebody is actually working on this. Right, I guess they're just too far away. Might have actually put some effort into work zones if I wanted this issue to not happen. Anyway, this is the village as it is right now. As you can see, there are some slightly different sizes for the buildings, but most of them use this trick where the roofs are completely on grid, and then the actual walls are really just basic shapes that are on half-grid pieces. With a few exceptions like this one where I had the path going next to it, so I had to find a way to keep this one on the grid. But that is actually just about it. Yeah, and this one is on the grid as well, since it serves as the toilet building. So that's also important. But the other ones are purely there for decoration, and I just had to find some creative ways to make them look a little bit less on grid. And then over here we have the scrambled eggs, which I always forget. This thing is called a twister in Parkitect, but I'm used to scrambled eggs, which I think is from the British version of Roller Coaster Tycoon. And of course our drop tower. So honestly, I would say this is really the main focus of the park, actually kind of the main street of the park, if main streets could be very rural and spaced out like this. The rest of the park is really just down to what the campaign has given me and just using the terrain to my advantage. So here we have the temple complex with right around the border of that the junior coaster. I should actually do some POVs of these coasters while I'm at it. You shouldn't forget that. We'll do that in a minute. This is a very standard junior coaster, but I do like the drop out of the station. That does add a bit of extra flair to it. But that aside, it could be a very standard Vekoma roller skater or a Zero of some sort. Let's actually do the hyper POV first, because this one's already ready, so we can just do a quick POV here. I tried to shape the drop out like an actual B&M hypercoaster. It looks a bit wonky, but I think it is a little bit better than just leaving it completely round. And as you can see, there are some very quick transitions on this, which with the lack of hard lining don't look that amazing. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the layout. It definitely feels like more of a new generation hypercoaster, like the one that they've been building in China, for instance. And I keep forgetting which park, but it has a lot of twists as opposed to just standard traditional airtime hills. And I really like that kind of layout, actually. I have to say my only B&M hypercoaster experience is limited to Silver Star in Europa Park, but I have to be honest and say that I found that extremely lame. So I love to see the variation that some newer hypercoasters have, as opposed to just being a few airtime hills in a row. So I guess that played a role in the design of this layout too. It also stays really close to the ground. I think it's quite terrain conforming for a hypercoaster. It's technically not even a hypercoaster, but you know, it's basically shaped like one, and it stays very close to the ground for one. You can kind of see the drop shape. It's very wide and spread out for an actual B&M hyper drop. But I think to some degree, at least, it does have that, the fact that it falls steeper and steeper, and keeps falling like that for a longer amount of time than you'd think, and only once you really need to pull up, it starts pulling up, which they tend to do in real life as well. Now let's write the junior coaster real quick. Really not too special, but I do like the interaction that it has with the paths and the fact that it goes underneath its own station. At least the terrain adds an extra element to this otherwise really standard layout. And I know I said many times that I get tired of building junior coasters in these scenarios because I do it every time. But it's also fun to come up with new layouts and new ways to add variations on this idea. And I also have to say, realistically, you just kind of have to have one of these in your park to be the junior coaster, to be the step-up coaster that kids can start on and then work their way toward the bigger rides. There's this really interesting quote that coaster enthusiasts are completely the opposite from other people in terms of how they ride coasters, because coaster enthusiasts tend to start with the big rides and then work up the courage to ride the small rides, because at the end of the day, you gotta ride those kiddie coasters for the coaster credit, but it's always a bit embarrassing, so you kind of tend to do everything else first to get that over with and to get the good stuff out of the way, and then work your way up to the kiddie coasters, which I find really hilarious. I'm not much of a credit whore myself. I've skipped out on a lot of kiddie coasters, but I think there's some truth to it. Anyway, that is wildly off topic. Aside from the coasters, I think the only really noteworthy thing, I suppose, is a little bit of a foliage trick that I did that I didn't really talk about during the time-lapse, is I did try to sort of emulate the okarikomi trees that you find throughout Japanese gardens, which are these round trees which are trimmed but kind of in a natural, organic, flowing way. And we don't have any trees like that in Parkitect, but we do have this little old blobby tree, which is one of the original trees in the game, if I'm not mistaken, which kind of resembles one. And I think in combination with sinking trees into the ground like this, for instance, which is not a big bush, but actually a tree sunken into the ground, and these smaller shrubs around the place, it does kind of emulate the style of trees and bushes that you find in Japanese gardens. But that's also something that I really just copied from the scenario as it came already as well. Funny that both of these coasters break down at the same time. Anyway, that's it for Pagoda Valley. I know, quite a simple scenario, but at least I really enjoyed the scenery aspect of it. And with that said, I'm going to save this map, and I think it's a good time to quit and see, well, for one, what the trophy is going to look like, because I actually don't know, and also what we get after this. Alright, so the trophy is the pagoda. That makes a lot of sense, especially for a map called Pagoda Valley. A fun fact about this pagoda, actually, it was lifted straight from Sidonia Hills, which is an old park that I made for Parkitect. Not sure if I already said that in this episode. My memory is super terrible, but yeah, just so you know. Anyway, the next one is going to be Sakura Gardens, as I thought beforehand, judging by all of the sakura around here, which is going to be interesting once I get to that. But I have to say, for the next episode, I'm kind of feeling like I want to work on Hickory Hill. It's quite a bit backwards from where we are at the moment, so I want to get that out of the way, and it's a really nice scenario as well, I think. At least map-wise. Otherwise, I think it could be quite punishing, but that's something which we'll get to experience next time. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I hope to see you in the next video.